The last days of winter have a particular kind of silence. Not peaceful, not still, the kind of silence that feels like something is missing. The road was empty that morning. Ice still edged the ditches. The sky was the color of old pewter, flat, low, pressing down on everything. She had driven this stretch 100 times. It was ordinary, forgettable, and then something at the edge of the ditch caught her eye. She almost kept driving. It was so small that at first she wasn't sure what she was seeing. A clump of leaves maybe, a piece of cloth blown from somewhere. She slowed the car, pulled over, stepped out into the cold air. The ground crunched under her boots. She took a few steps toward the ditch and stopped. It was an animal, curled tight against itself like something trying to disappear, fur matted, body barely moving. So still that for one terrible second she thought she was already too late. Then she saw the breath, faint, slow, but there. She bent down, reached out carefully, and the moment her fingers came close, the animal opened its eyes. She would talk about that moment for years afterward. Not because of what she saw, but because of how it looked at her. There was no panic, no hissing, no desperate scrambling away. It simply watched her, quiet, steady, eyes the color of pale winter light, holding her gaze with something she couldn't name. Not fear, not trust either. Something in between. She picked it up gently, cradling it against her coat. It weighed almost nothing, but it didn't struggle, didn't cry, just stayed perfectly still in her hands as she carried it back to the warmth of the car. She didn't know yet what she was holding. None of them did. Back home, the family gathered around the kitchen table. She had wrapped the kitten in a soft blanket and placed it near the heating vent. It hadn't moved much, hadn't made a sound. It lay there breathing in small, careful measures, eyes half open, watching the room with an expression that seemed too composed for something so fragile. Her husband stood back, arms crossed, brow furrowed. Her daughter crouched nearby, whispering reassurances in that gentle way young people do when they're scared but trying not to show it. Nobody wanted to say out loud what they were all thinking. Is it going to make it? The debate started quietly. Wildlife rehabilitator? Emergency vet? There was a center about 40 minutes away that handled injured animals. Maybe the right move was to call them tonight, let the professionals take over. That was the responsible thing. That was the sensible thing. But it was late, it was cold, and the kitten was still breathing. They decided to keep it warm through the night and call in the morning. They gave it water with a dropper, found an old heating pad in the closet, lined a box with towels, and set it in the corner of the kitchen, away from drafts, away from noise. The kitten accepted all of it without protest. Too exhausted, they assumed. But there was something else that none of them could quite articulate yet. Something about the way it observed them, not with the overwhelmed confusion of a lost house cat, but with a focused, deliberate attention, as if it was studying them, cataloging every movement, every sound. The dog walked in, curious. The kitten tracked it immediately, body stiffening almost imperceptibly, eyes sharp and locked. The dog retreated to its bed, unbothered, but the kitten stayed alert for another 20 minutes, watching, waiting, processing. Her daughter finally said it. It doesn't act like any kitten I've ever seen. No one disagreed. By morning it had eaten a small amount, hadn't used the litter box they'd set nearby, hadn't sought any of them out for comfort. But every time one of them entered the kitchen, those pale eyes found them immediately, not afraid, just watching. They drove to the vet that afternoon. She sat in the waiting room with the kitten wrapped in its blanket, feeling the strange weight of it against her arm. It hadn't made a single sound the entire drive. Most cats she'd known would have voiced strong opinions about a car trip. This one simply watched the passing scenery through the window, with an expression of concentrated calm. The vet was thorough, careful. She examined the kitten for a long time without speaking, occasionally glancing up with an expression that was hard to read. Then she set her instruments down and said something that changed everything. "I don't think this is a domestic kitten." The room went quiet. She looked down at the small creature in the blanket, at those pale, still eyes looking back at her, at the slightly rounded ears, the dense fur, the particular width of that face. "What do you mean?" she asked. The vet was already pulling out her reference materials. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the questions she hadn't known to ask yet began forming one by one. What exactly had she pulled from that frozen ditch? Where had it come from? And what were they supposed to do now? The name came from a Russian naturalist, Peter Simon Pallas, 18th century, a man who spent years cataloging the wildlife of Central Asia and the Siberian steppe, creatures most of the world had never seen and couldn't have imagined. He documented a small wild cat found across the grasslands and rocky highlands, compact, dense-furred, flat-faced, with eyes that sat differently than a domestic cat's, more forward, more still, giving the animal an expression that looked almost philosophical, almost ancient. Pallas's cat, Autocolobus manual, one of the oldest wildcat lineages on Earth. The vet turned the reference page around slowly and set it on the table. For a long moment nobody spoke. She looked at the photograph, then at the kitten in the blanket, then back at the photograph. The resemblance was not subtle, the same wide, low-set ears, the same dense, silver-tipped fur, the same extraordinary eyes, pale and wide and watchful in a way that suddenly made complete sense. This animal hadn't been looking at her family with the dazed confusion of a lost house cat. It had been doing what its species had done for millions of years, assessing, calculating, surviving. "How did it end up in a roadside ditch in the middle of winter?" her husband asked. The vet shook her head slowly. Pallas's cats existed in the wild across Central Asia, Mongolia, Tibet, the Russian steppe. In the United States, they were occasionally found in private exotic animal facilities, sometimes in zoos. Rarely, very rarely, they turned up in circumstances like this one. Young, separated, alone, how it had come to be beside that frozen road was a question they might never answer. What they could answer was simpler and harder. What happened next? The vet was careful with her words. Pallas's cats were not domestic animals. They were not socializable in the way a barn cat or even a feral kitten might be. They were built for solitude, for rocky terrain, for a life that had nothing to do with living rooms and kitchen floors. There were wildlife sanctuaries, specialists, people trained to handle exactly this kind of situation. She gave them a list of contacts, told them to think it over carefully, told them not to get attached. On the drive home, nobody spoke for a long time. The kitten sat wrapped in its blanket on her daughter's lap and watched the road ahead with those quiet, ancient eyes. They told themselves it was temporary. That word did a lot of work in the weeks that followed. Temporary feeding schedule, temporary sleeping arrangement, temporary adjustment to life in the house, while they figured out the next step. They called 2 of the contacts on the vet's list, left messages, got responses that were polite but slow. There were wait lists, assessments required. Paperwork. The process, it turned out, was not simple. And in the meantime, he was still there. They had started calling him Mal. It wasn't a planned decision. It came from the Latin name, Manuel, shortened without ceremony one evening when her daughter said, "Has Mal eaten yet?" And somehow, without discussion, it stuck. Naming him was probably a mistake. They knew that. They did it anyway. Mal recovered slowly but steadily. The weakness left his legs first, then his eyes cleared. Then the careful, deliberate way he moved began to shift into something more intentional, more directed. He started exploring, not in the chaotic, bouncing way of a domestic kitten discovering the world. Methodical, room by room, low to the ground, pausing in doorways to assess before entering, checking corners, testing surfaces, mapping the space with a patience that seemed almost impossible in something so young. He climbed everything, bookshelves, counter edges, the back of the couch. Not for play, or at least not only for play. He sought elevation the way some people seek high ground in unfamiliar territory. To see, to know the full shape of where he was. From up high, he watched them. He was not an affectionate animal. That was simply the truth of him, and the family had to learn to stop measuring him by the wrong standard. He didn't seek laps, didn't ask for scratching behind the ears, didn't announce himself with the easy sociability of a pet who had been shaped over thousands of years to want human company. He chose his own distance, always 3 or 4 feet of space between himself and whoever was in the room. Not hostile, not fearful, just deliberate. The distance felt considered, like a boundary set by someone who had thought carefully about what they needed. Sudden movements unsettled him deeply. A door swinging open too fast, a dropped pan, a laugh that came too loud and too sudden. In those moments his body would drop into a low, flat stillness, eyes wide, every muscle locked, not frozen in fear exactly, but recalibrating, gathering information. Then, slowly, he would ease out of it, shake slightly, resume whatever he had been doing. Her husband started moving through the house differently, more slowly, more quietly. He didn't mention it for weeks, but she noticed. The trust came in pieces so small you could miss them if you weren't paying attention. A Tuesday evening, Mal crossing the kitchen and pausing, for just a moment, beside her feet before moving on. A Saturday afternoon, her daughter reading on the couch, and Mal choosing the other end of the same couch rather than the chair across the room. One morning, she came downstairs to find him sitting outside the bedroom door, not asking to be let in, just there, waiting near the place where she slept. She stood in the hallway and looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, then he walked away, unhurried, and jumped to his window perch as if nothing had happened. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to. They stopped calling the contacts on the vet's list. They didn't discuss it out loud. There was no family meeting, no decision announced over dinner. It was more like a quiet consensus that settled over the house the way snow settles, gradually, without drama, until one day you look out the window and realize the ground has been covered for a while now. Mal was theirs, or more accurately, they were his. He had reorganized the house without asking permission. The good blanket on the back of the couch was his now. The third shelf of the bookcase belonged to him. There was a path along the back of the kitchen counters that the family had stopped using because it was where he walked on his evening rounds, and disrupting it felt wrong. They had built their routines around a wild animal and barely noticed it happening. Which is why the night it happened hit so hard. It was an ordinary evening, dinner, television low, the comfortable quiet that had become normal. She had opened the back door to check the weather, just for a moment, just a crack, the way she did sometimes in the evenings. She got distracted. Her husband called her name from the other room. She went to answer. The door was open for maybe 4 minutes. When she came back, she pulled it closed, went to the couch, reached automatically toward Mal's usual spot on the blanket. Her hand found nothing. She looked up. She checked his shelf, his window perch, the bedroom, the bathroom, the closet he sometimes disappeared into. Nothing. She went back to the door, opened it, looked out into the dark backyard. Cold air moved past her face, and somewhere out there, nothing moved. She stood in the open doorway for a long time. The backyard was dark, the kind of dark that comes after the last of winter finally releases its hold, early spring, when the nights are still cold enough to remind you that warmth isn't guaranteed yet. The grass was wet. The tree line at the back of the property was a black wall against a slightly less black sky. She called his name once, quietly, the way you do when you already know there won't be an answer. Her husband appeared behind her, took in the open door, took in her face. Didn't ask the question out loud because he already knew. They got their coats. They searched the backyard first, flashlight sweeping low across the wet grass, checking under the deck, behind the woodpile, along the fence line. Her daughter came downstairs and understood immediately, and went out through the side gate to check the front yard without being asked. An hour passed. The flashlight found nothing but wet ground and the ordinary darkness of a suburban night. She stood in the middle of the backyard and let herself feel, for the first time, the full weight of what she had known for months but never said directly. He was a wild animal. He had always been a wild animal. And some part of her had always understood that the door between his world and hers was not a permanent barrier. It was just a door, one that could open, one that eventually, inevitably might. Her husband touched her shoulder gently. "Come inside. It's cold." She didn't move for another minute. They left the back door cracked that night. Just slightly, just enough. A folded towel wedged at the base to keep the cold from flooding the kitchen floor. She set his blanket near the opening, put a small dish of food just inside the threshold. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, which had taken on a particular quality of silence she recognized from the very first night she had brought him home. The silence of something missing, the absence that has a shape. Her daughter appeared in the doorway around 2 in the morning. Still nothing? Still nothing. Her daughter sat on the edge of the bed. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say that wouldn't make it worse. After a while her daughter went back to her room, and the house settled back into its quiet, and she stared at the ceiling until the gray light of early morning began at the edges of the curtains. The first day passed slowly. She moved through it with the specific numbness that comes not from absence of feeling but from too much of it, emotion compressed into something dense and heavy that sits in the chest and makes ordinary tasks feel like they're happening at a slight distance. She made coffee. She answered emails. She went to the grocery store. At the grocery store she stood in the pet food aisle for 4 minutes before realizing what she was doing and putting the can back on the shelf. By the second day she had begun to construct the narrative she would need in order to survive this. He had gone back to where he belonged. That was the right ending for an animal like him. The wild was where Pallas's cats lived. Rocky terrain, open steppe, cold air, space in every direction. She had given him warmth when he needed it, stability, time to recover and grow strong. And now he was strong enough. She told herself this the way you tell yourself things you need to be true. Some of it even worked. Her husband searched the neighborhood on the third morning. He didn't announce it. She watched him from the kitchen window, moving along the fence line, checking under the neighbor's deck, scanning the tree line at the back of the property, with the quiet determination of someone who has decided that doing something is better than doing nothing. He came back empty-handed, poured himself coffee, stood at the counter for a moment. "He's smart," he said finally. "He knows how to stay out of sight." She wasn't sure if he meant it as reassurance or just as something to say. Maybe both. The fourth day was the hardest. There was something about the crossing from days into almost a week that made it feel final in a way the earlier days hadn't. She found herself doing the things she had promised herself she wouldn't, calculating odds, thinking about the temperature at night, still dropping into the 30s, thinking about dogs in the neighborhood, cars on the main road 2 blocks over. She took his blanket from near the back door and folded it carefully and set it on the shelf where he used to sit. She wasn't sure why. It felt like something you did. Her daughter found her in the kitchen that evening, standing at the counter not doing anything in particular. "Mom, I'm fine, I know." A pause. "I keep thinking about that first night, when you brought him in from the ditch." She nodded. "He looked at you like he was deciding something," her daughter said. "Remember? He just looked at you." She remembered. "Maybe he's still deciding," her daughter said quietly. It was a kind thing to say. She wasn't sure she believed it, but she held on to it anyway. The 5th day was quiet. The 6th day was quiet. She had stopped leaving the back door cracked at night. The cold was too much, and some practical part of her had accepted what the rest of her hadn't finished grieving yet. She kept the food dish inside, near the door, refilled daily without quite being able to stop. Her husband didn't comment on it. The dog had been subdued all week. He kept going to Mal's shelf and sniffing at it, and then retreating to his bed with an expression that looked, in its way, like understanding. The house felt smaller than it used to. On the 7th evening she was in the kitchen. Late, everyone else already in bed. She was making tea, the specific kind of not sleeping that isn't quite insomnia, just a mind that won't quiet down enough for rest. The kitchen light was low. Rain had started an hour ago, soft and steady against the windows. She stood at the counter holding her mug, and then she heard it, so faint she thought at first she had imagined it. A sound at the back door, soft, irregular, the particular quality of something small and tired making minimal effort, scratching. She set down her mug, crossed to the door. Her hand hesitated on the handle, just for a moment, just one breath, because some part of her was afraid of what she might find, or might not find. The mind protects itself in strange ways. It prepares for disappointment even when it's hoping. She opened the door. He was standing on the back step, wet through, fur flattened against his body by the rain, which had stolen the volume and silver-tipped softness, and left him looking smaller than she remembered, and thinner, and exhausted in a way that went all the way down to his bones. He looked up at her. Those pale eyes, that steady, assessing gaze, the same look he had given her from a frozen ditch on a cold winter morning, when she had been a stranger and he had been barely alive. He was breathing harder than normal, but he was there. She crouched down slowly, didn't reach for him, didn't make a sound, just lowered herself to his level and stayed very still and let him make whatever choice he was going to make. He stood in the rain for another moment. Then he walked through the door, past her, into the warmth, directly to his shelf, where his folded blanket was waiting without her quite having planned it that way. He stepped onto it, turned once, lay down. She stayed crouched in the open doorway for a long moment, cold air and rain at her back, warm kitchen light in front of her. She became aware, distantly, that she was crying, not dramatically, just quietly and without much warning, the way relief sometimes arrives when you've been holding against it for too long. She closed the door, stood up, looked at him, already still, already watching her with those calm, ancient eyes from his shelf, as if he had never been gone, as if this was simply where things were always going to end up. And it was only then, standing in her quiet kitchen at midnight with rain on the windows and her wild creature dry and breathing and home, that she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. He hadn't come back because he was lost. He hadn't come back because he was too weak or too small or too accustomed to comfort to survive out there. He was a Pallas's cat. He was built for the cold, built for the dark, built for exactly the kind of world that existed beyond that back door. He had come back because he had chosen to. And that choice, was something she hadn't been prepared for, something she didn't have words for yet, something she would spend a long time thinking about. Spring came the way it always does after a hard winter, not all at once, not with any announcement, just gradually, incrementally, the light lasting a little longer each evening, and the mornings losing their sharpest edge until one day you step outside and realize the cold has quietly packed up and gone, without telling you when it left. Mal noticed before any of them did. He began spending long stretches at the window, the east-facing one in the living room that caught the morning light first. He would sit there in the early hours, perfectly still, watching the backyard with that focused attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. The birds returning, the ground softening, the particular quality of light that comes when the season is changing. She would come downstairs and find him there, and make her coffee, and not disturb him. It had become its own kind of ritual. 4 months had passed since the night he came back. He was fully grown now, or close enough that the difference was academic. The fragile, matted creature she had carried in from the roadside ditch had become something that commanded a room simply by being in it. Dense and compact and moving with that low, deliberate grace that made every surface he crossed seem like it had been designed for exactly that purpose. He was not large, Pallas's cats never are, but there was a quality of presence about him that had nothing to do with size. Her husband had said it once, and said it well. He doesn't take up much space, but you always know exactly where he is. The house had changed around him so gradually that it was difficult to identify when each thing had shifted. The third shelf of the bookcase was simply his now. Nobody put books there anymore. The good blanket on the back of the couch had been replaced twice, once when it wore thin, once when her daughter brought home a softer one that she had selected, without comment, from a store display. The path along the back of the kitchen counter remained clear. The dog had long since established a respectful, comfortable distance, not fearful, not submissive, just the particular arrangement two animals work out between themselves when they've been given enough time and space to do it without interference. Even the sounds of the house had adjusted. Doors opened more slowly. Conversations near him settled into quieter registers. Footsteps on the hardwood had taken on a different quality, more considered, more aware. A family that had lived one way for years had, without quite deciding to, learned to live differently. She thought about that sometimes. How much of what we call home is actually just the accumulated weight of small adjustments we've made for the people and creatures we love. How the space you live in is never really static. It shifts constantly, reshaping itself around whoever is inside it. Mal had reshaped theirs, not by demanding anything, not by being difficult exactly, though he had certainly been that in the early days, but simply by being consistently, entirely himself, and leaving them no real choice but to meet him there. He still didn't seek affection the way a domestic cat would. That had not changed, and she had stopped expecting it to. It was simply part of who he was, the chosen distance, the observational stillness, the way he engaged with the world on his own terms and no others. But the trust had deepened into something she found harder to describe. It wasn't demonstrative. It didn't announce itself. It lived in the texture of ordinary moments, the way he would walk through a room where she was working and slow his pace slightly as he passed her, as if acknowledging her presence in some small private way. The way he had begun, in recent weeks, to sometimes rest in the same room she was in when she read in the evenings, not close, never quite close, but present, choosing the same space. Her daughter had started calling it parallel contentment. She thought that was exactly right. Her husband had changed in ways he probably couldn't fully articulate. She had watched it happen slowly over the months. He was a man who had always moved through the world at a certain pace, efficient, purposeful, task-oriented in the way that capable people often are. He got things done. He fixed things. He solved problems and moved to the next one. Mal had no interest in any of that. Mal could not be fixed or solved or moved through efficiently. He required a different quality of attention, patient, unhurried, receptive rather than directive. You couldn't make anything happen with Mal. You could only create the conditions and wait. Her husband had learned that. She watched him sometimes, sitting in the living room in the evening with Mal at the other end of the couch, neither of them doing anything in particular, and she thought that stillness didn't used to be available to him. It was now. There was one afternoon in early summer she would return to often in the years that followed. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. The windows were open, and a warm breeze moved through the house, carrying the smell of cut grass and something faintly floral from the neighbor's yard. Her daughter was home for the weekend, sitting at the kitchen table with a book. Her husband was somewhere in the back of the house. The dog was asleep in his usual spot near the door. And Mal was on his shelf. He had been there all afternoon, watching the window, watching the room, doing the slow and patient work of simply existing in the world. She was on the couch with her own book, not reading it, just feeling the afternoon settle around her. And then Mal stepped down from his shelf, crossed the room, jumped up onto the couch, not onto her lap, not curled against her side. He landed at the far end and stood there for a moment considering. Then he turned and walked, deliberately, unhurried, along the length of the couch until he reached her, and then he stopped. He stepped once, carefully, and settled. His weight against her leg was small and warm and entirely real. She didn't move, didn't reach for him, didn't say anything. He tucked his chin down slightly and closed his eyes. Outside the window, the afternoon continued, breeze moving through the trees, birds somewhere distant, the ordinary, irreplaceable sound of summer. She thought about the ditch, the frozen ground, the flat pewter sky, the way she had almost kept driving. She thought about all the choices that had led to this moment, hers and his both, the choice to stop, the choice to pick up something small and fragile from the cold ground, the choice, 7 days into his disappearance, to leave the food dish filled, his choice, and she believed, fully, that it had been a choice, to come back. She thought about what the vet had told them at the beginning. Don't get attached. The thing about that advice, the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood then, was that it assumed attachment was optional, that it was something you could choose or not choose based on information and good judgment. But attachment doesn't work that way. Not really. Not when something looks at you from a frozen ditch with those calm, ancient eyes, and something passes between you that you can't name but can't forget either. It had never been a question of whether she would get attached. It had only ever been a question of what that attachment would become. She looked down at him, still and warm and breathing quietly beside her. All that wild distance, all those careful inches of chosen space, all the months of patient adjustment, of learning to read a creature whose language was nothing like the ones she already knew. It had led here, to an ordinary afternoon in early summer, to a couch by an open window, to the small, specific weight of something that trusted you enough to rest. She had told the story many times since then, to friends, to neighbors, to the vet who had first said, "I don't think this is a domestic kitten," and set everything in motion. Each time, people wanted to know what it felt like, what it meant, to share a life with something so genuinely wild. She always had to think about how to answer that, because the truth was quieter than people expected, less dramatic, less defined by the extraordinary moments, the frozen ditch, the disappearance, the late-night scratching at the door, and more by everything that came after. By the slow, unglamorous work of learning to love something on its own terms, by the way it changes you, that work, how it asks you to be more patient than you thought you were, more still, more willing to sit with uncertainty and not rush toward resolution, how it teaches you, finally, that the deepest connections are not the ones you build, but the ones you make room for. And in the end, she would say, when people asked, when she tried to find the right words for something that kept resisting them, in the end it was simple, not easy, but simple. We didn't rescue him just to survive. We brought him in from the cold. We kept the light on when he disappeared. We learned to be quiet enough that he wasn't afraid. And somewhere in all of that, without ceremony, without announcement, he became family. Not because we made him, because we made room, and he walked in,